we have Jonathan Swabish, who is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute in the United States. His talk is going to focus on diverse, equitable and inclusive awareness, DEI, in data viz. How can people apply a non-biased lens to their data to reflect the lived experiences and cultures for all of those they are trying to include in their work? Jonathan Swabish is an economist. He creates policy-relevant data viz. He's also written a number of books and teaches, always with a focus on helping people to clearly communicate their findings in an accessible way. So, Jonathan, over to you for your talk entitled Applying Diverse, Equitable and Inclusive Awareness in Data Visualization.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone, or where I am, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm going to talk about this work, as was mentioned, on taking a racially equitable approach and awareness to our data communication efforts. Because for those of us who are working with data, collecting data, analyzing data, and ultimately communicating data, it's really imperative for us to reflect the lived experiences of the people and communities that we're focusing on and that we're communicating with. And this work is joint with my Urban Institute colleague, Alice Feng, where we interviewed more than 20 different people across the United States to get their experiences with taking this more diverse and equitable approach to their work. Now, this work, of course, came out of the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of the racial justice protests here in the United States over the last 2 years or so. And after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and far too many others, we thought about how could we, as people working in the fields of data communication and public policy, contribute to this discussion. And we thought, because data visualization is so powerful, as you've heard already today, we thought that this would be an area in which we could talk about how we as data communicators could take a better approach to our work. Now, I think it's important to just do a little level setting before I get further into content. I am a middle-aged, unfortunately this far into the pandemic, feel more middle-aged than ever, a middle-aged white male here living in the United States. So my lived experience is obviously going to be very different than your experience in other regions of the world. It's also going to be very different from other people here in the United States. Now, I am a Jewish American. I have had my experience with anti-Semitism, but that, of course, is a very different experience than perhaps not being able or being fearful of walking down the street at nighttime or being afraid of what might happen if I'm pulled over by the police. But that being said, as someone who spends a lot of time in public policy research, someone who visualizes and communicates data, as just a member of society and as a husband and father, I think it's really important for us to be having these conversations because, as I said, as data visualization grows and becomes more powerful and more important, we need to be thinking about how we can integrate these concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion into our data visualization work. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 different practical areas that I think you can use in your everyday work right today, this afternoon or this evening. You'll be able to go back to your work and hopefully employ some of these strategies. What we're not going to talk about, what we don't talk about in detail, are visualizations that are explicitly racist. So as an example, this visualization is a map of Chicago, Illinois, here in the United States. It was created by a federal agency in the late 1930s and 40s called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So the HOLC was responsible for assessing mortgage risk in different metropolitan areas of the United States. And they created a set of these maps for each of these different metropolitan areas. And these maps are known as redlining maps. It might be a term that you've heard. What you see in this map is the green and blue areas of Chicago were deemed to be low risk, so more attractive neighborhoods for people to buy homes and to live in. A neighborhood, however, earned a red color if any Black or African American person lived in that neighborhood. And it didn't matter if it was a single middle class family homes, didn't matter really the quality of the neighborhood. As long as a Black or African American person lived in that neighborhood, it was deemed a higher risk or less attractive neighborhood. And so many of us may not actually see a map like this and see it as being explicitly racist. But these maps have had a long and enduring impact on the wealth accumulation among Black and African American headed households in the United States. And so I want to show you a description of this map that the Hulk wrote, specifically about this map. And I'll give you just a moment to read this quote. And I think we could all agree that this sentence is explicitly racist, but that's not necessarily the case for how people look at visualizations. But it is true that visualizations can be explicitly racist, and they can have important and enduring impacts on people and communities. So, as I mentioned, we interviewed more than 20 different people for this report across the fields of research, public policy, data journalism, and what we found was an underlying through line, an underlying theme of demonstrating empathy for the people and communities that we're visualizing and that we're communicating with. And I want to sum that up by this quote from Kim Bui, who's a data journalist based in Arizona. Kim told us, she said, if I were one of the data points in this visualization, would I feel offended? And I think that's a really easy way for us as people creating visualizations to think about how we use colors, icons, words, whatever we create in and around our visualizations. Would I, as the person being represented, feel offended by being shown, by seeing myself in that visualization? So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about four areas. I'm going to talk about four areas that I think we can all use in our visualizations today. So I'm going to start with talking about language. And one of the things, at least here in the United States, that we tend to focus on for many communities is using people first language. It's not for every community, but for many communities, we use people first language. So instead of saying disabled people, we might say people with disabilities. And the challenge, of course, with language, and I, of course, I'm taking primarily a US-centric view in this entire body of work, so there's going to be differences across the world and across region and nationality. But the thing about language is that it's always nuanced and it's evolving and it's changing. So words and phrases that we use today may not be words that we use tomorrow and may not be words that we used in the past. I'm going to give you a quick example here from the United States experience. First, let's look at this simple sentence. And I'm just going to give you a second to read both of these sentences. And what you can see here is the very subtle change in the tone and the implication of this sentence. In the first sentence, the onus or the responsibility is placed on Black people. Why are they so less likely to receive loans from the bank? What is it about them? What is the blame placed on Black people? Whereas in the second sentence, we talk about we ask really, why are banks less likely to give loans to Black people? What is it about the banks that that have this practice? Let's talk about describing Hispanic and Latino people here in the United States. So for many years, last several decades, we've used the terms Hispanic and Latino. And more recently, we've used this term Latinx, which gets away from the binary gender description, but can also be a little harder to say, both in English and in Spanish. And so the question is, as so many more people and organizations use this term Latinx, is that a term that people who identify as Hispanic and Latino actually prefer? Well, it turns out that we have some evidence about this. So back in August of 2020, the Pew Research Center did a survey of people who identified as Hispanic and Latino, and 2/3 of them said that they thought that the word Latinx should not be used to describe their population. Similarly, just a few months ago, in July of 2021, the Gallup poll did a survey, again, of people who identified as Hispanic and Latino, and asked them about their preferred terms. And as you can see here, about 23% preferred the word Hispanic, 15% Latino, and only 4% preferred the word Latinx. So we have some evidence already from these two questions that people in this particular ethnic group do not prefer that term. Let's take this one step further. Gallup then asked a follow-up question and said, okay, if you had to pick a term, what term would you choose? And among those, again, people who identified as Hispanic and Latino, 57% said they preferred the word Hispanic, 37% said they preferred the word Latino, and only 5% said they preferred the term Latinx. So while we've seen a growth and an increase in the popularity and the use of this term Latinx, we now have at least 2 data points where that term is not preferred by the population that it is being used to describe. And so more recently, we've seen an evolution away from the word Latinx towards the word Latine, which is also gender fluid, but also is a little bit easier to pronounce in both English and Spanish. All right, now let's get to language in data visualization specifically. What you see in front of you is the top third of a Tableau dashboard. There are 3 bivariate choropleth maps in this dashboard. The first one is for people who identify as Black. There's another map I'm not showing here for people who identify as Hispanic, and a third for people who identify as white. Let me first give you just a Data Viz 101 on what a bivariate choropleth map is. So a choropleth map is a map in which we shade the geographic regions, it might be state or country or whatever it might be, using different colors. In this map, what's called a choropleth map, we're shading the states in the United States based on their unemployment rate. So states with a lower unemployment rate have a light blue color, and states with a darker color have higher unemployment rates. Well, if we have that single color band, we can extend that to what's called a bivariate choropleth map, in which instead of one variable, one metric, we have 2 metrics. So I'm going to zoom in on the legend in this map so you can see what's being plotted. So on the vertical axis, we have the poverty rate, where we go from that light purple to the darker purple. And along the horizontal axis, we have the density of people who identify as Black. And so counties in the United States that have a lower density of Black residents and a lower poverty rate are in that light peachish orange color, mostly in the middle part of the country. And then counties that have a higher density of Black residents and a higher poverty rate are in that very, very dark purple color, that almost black color in the southeastern part of the United States. So now you know how a bivariate choropleth map works. We've seen many of them over the previous year or so, more recently showing COVID vaccinations versus COVID infection rates. But let's focus on the words that are used in this legend. Along the vertical axis, this phrase, more poverty. Well, poverty is an experience. It's not a static description of a person or household. I could be considered in poverty this year, but not necessarily next year. And more importantly, for this particular work, the phrase more Black references skin color, doesn't reference people. And so if we want to take a more equitable, inclusive approach, we probably want to try a phrase, a word, a term that is more inclusive and references people, not the color of their skin. So in this case, we might want to use the phrase larger proportion of the Black population and larger proportion of people in poverty. These are more verbose, they're longer, maybe they don't fit as nicely in the legend or in a bar chart or in a table. But again, when we represent people, do we think that they would feel offended by being referred to as more Black? I certainly feel like I would be offended if the phrase was more Jewish. So we need to be taking that empathetic approach to the people and communities that we are trying to communicate with. And I'll just say that after some discussion with the original author, they ended up changing this from more Black to larger Black population, which I think is another point to make about us needing to be open to have these conversations and be able to be willing to make change and to learn and evolve. All right, so I've talked about a language. Let me move into talking about missing groups. And I'm differentiating here between missing groups, which is groups that are not captured at all in the survey, versus missing data, in which maybe I don't have an observation, someone didn't answer the question on income or region or whatever sort of status. So perhaps the easiest way to think about this is with gender. We know that gender is not binary, and yet most surveys, especially here in the United States, still frame the question around gender as binary, as male, female. What you see in front of you is just examples of questions about gender from 6 different major federal surveys here in the United States, each asking the question in a binary format, male, female. Now, we've seen lots of examples of people not doing this well. Here's a series of drop-down menus in other surveys of people kind of perhaps not doing a good job. I think my favorite here is the one in the top right, where the options are male, female, and human. Probably not the most inclusive way to describe or prompt people to describe themselves in this population. We can apply this to race as well. What you see here are basically the 6 or so most common aggregate racial groups that are collected primarily by the US Census Bureau. And if we estimated the poverty rate for these 6 large groups, we would find singular estimates. But in these questions, in particular the American Community Survey, respondents are able to write in more detail. So they're able to check the box for American Indian or Alaskan Native, but then write in more detail so they could identify themselves, for example, from the Sioux tribal nation. And if we look at poverty rates for those different groups, we see huge variation in just this one metric. So for example, in that American Indian or Alaskan Native category, the overall poverty rate is 23%, but it varies from about 5% on the left end to almost 40% on the right end. So we see huge variation here when we dive a little bit deeper and we think a little more carefully and with a more thought and awareness toward inclusiveness than if we just look at these aggregate groups. And what about this other group, the dreaded other category? I mean, we are literally othering people when we use that word to describe people. They are not included in the survey itself. Now, the word other itself, at least obviously in English, I find the definition very interesting, especially this fifth entry in the dictionary. Disturbingly or threateningly different. I think there's a connotation around the word other that this group, again, not captured in the survey, because it's this last option where someone checks other. They're not included in the other questions, or the other options. And so there's this connotation that that group is somehow a disturbance or somehow a threat. So what terms could we use instead of the word other to get around this issue of othering people? Well, a lot of people we spoke to suggested the word another, which, as you can see here, doesn't necessarily match up grammatically in terms of its usage, but we could probably get around the word other, the word another in this use case. But we think we have some additional options for you to consider. And obviously, this is going to vary based on your region, your country, your language, of course, as well. But here are some alternatives that we think are useful. Another race or races, additional groups, all other self-descriptions, people identifying as other or multiple races, identity not listed, and identity not listed in the survey. All are true and all are viable alternatives to the word other, even though the person in the survey selected the box, checked the box for the option other. We think to be more inclusive and be more equitable in our work, we as a data communicator could go in and say, we have decided to use the phrase all other self-descriptions here, even though the original survey used the option other. So we think these are some alternatives to this phrase and option of othering people. And of course, we're open to hearing more options that we could use. And of course, are interested in hearing what you might use in your specific experience. I think we could all agree when CNN describes people as something else. That's definitely not how we want to describe people. Again, would I feel offended if I was described as something else? I think I probably would be. All right, let me talk. I've talked about language. I've talked about missing groups. Let's talk about icons very quickly. Icons are a great way to help people see themselves in the data. And this is sort of an infamous data visualization. It was largely derided for a long time on Twitter and elsewhere. We've got the stereotypical pink colors showing these different plates. The graph doesn't start at 0. The icons are not sized by height, they're sized by area. I used to describe this graph as saying, oh, I bet women from India are really offended by seeing themselves presented this way. And then a woman from Latvia was in one of my classes, and she says, well, what about me? Like, I don't feel like I'm some huge giant here. And I want to share with you a tweet from photographer Saba Ibrahim, who wrote, and this was about a year ago, she wrote, as an Indian woman, I can confirm that too much of my time is spent hiding behind a rock, praying the terrifying gang of international giant ladies and their Latvian general don't find me. Which I think is sort of a funny, tongue-in-cheek tweet here. But I think it also is a perfect demonstration of how people see themselves in the data. In this very simple visualization, she sees herself in the data and how she's being represented. More recently, I've seen a series of visualizations from Eurostat being shown, and you can see the icon here. This is people showing people at risk of poverty in these different countries. And does this icon strike us as something that how we would want to be presented with the as a clearly feminine icon, pulling the pockets out as if they're empty, and also that the icon here isn't aligned with the right part of the chart, right? The shorter bars mean less people are at risk for poverty. And they've done, and this is used similarly in this graphic as well. And so I think we really need to be careful in our use of icons, especially when we are representing people. And even just more generally, we see sort of disturbing or stereotypical, I should say, use of icons. If you go right now and search for nurse icon in a Google image search, you'll find page upon page of icons that we would particularly identify as feminine. And similarly, if you did a search for boss icon, you would see page upon page of icons that we would identify as masculine. And so there is still this gendered, racial, ethnic categories, default categories that are being shown to us and promoted to us. But again, icons can be useful, and they can lend themselves to helping people see themselves in the visualization, as opposed to, for example, a bar chart, which is these abstract rectangles, abstract shapes. Can we use icons to help represent people and help people see themselves in the data, which can be very important. But again, we need to be careful with how we represent people and how we can do so in an equitable and inclusive way. So I've talked about language, I've talked about missing groups, I've talked about icons. The last thing I want to talk about is color, because color is so important in the data visualization toolkit. And again, I'm going to demonstrate this with an example. This is a Tableau dashboard. I'm going to zoom in on the legend in a second so you can see it in more detail. This is a Tableau dashboard from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology looking at diversity in their student body. And so in the line chart on the left, you can see changes over time. And in the stack chart on the right, you can see the distribution of different students by race and ethnic category by different colleges or departments within the university. So let me zoom into the legend here so you can see what's being represented. So we have 9 different categories here. In the top left, we have students who identify as Black or African American in the dark red color. The bottom of that first column, we have students who identify as Asian. And in the right column, we have 4 other categories: students who are white in the blue square, and then international students and students who don't identify their race in the shades of gray. Okay, there are at least 2 problems with this legend. The first is that all students of color are lumped into this sequential color palette from light red to dark red, whereas white students are in the singular blue color, which implies that we should be comparing all students of color to students who identify as white, making white the norm, making white the default, right? And so we want to think about, why is that selection being made? Why should we be comparing all these groups to white students? Why should white be the norm or the default? There's a more important problem here. If we go back, if you recall, to our choropleth map, where we had the sequential color palette, lower unemployment rates with the light blue color, and higher unemployment rates with the dark blue color, that sequential color palette is being used here. And in this case, it implies that Black or African American students are somehow greater than or more than students who identify as 2 or more races, which is certainly not an implication that we want to have in our visualizations. So after a little bit of feedback on social media, MIT changed the dashboard. You can see the new version here, and here's the zoom in on the legend. You can see again that now we have 4 or 5 groups in these shades of blue, so it's a little bit better, but we really haven't got to individual categories. We're still sort of comparing groups against one another. Now, I'm not saying it's easy to pick out 9 separate colors. I can pick out 9 separate colors from the Color Brewer tool, which is one of the more popular tools here. But you can still see that we have shades of green and shades of blue, so we really haven't gotten around this particular problem. So one thing that we can all consider when we have these multiple groups on a single graph is whether we can break them up, whether we could use a small multiples approach instead of having to compare each of these groups against one another. So as just one single example, this is from Bloomberg, more recently, showing these percentage of workers for each of these different racial groups, not on the same graph where perhaps we try to compare them against one another, but more look within each of these racial groups. So I hope this was useful. I hope you'll be able to use some of this material, some of these lessons in your own work. And I want to remind you, especially for those of us who are inclined to be quantitative researchers, quantitative visualization experts, that we always kind of end up sitting behind our computer and typing in our data and writing our code and making our visualizations. But it's always important to remember that data are a reflection of real people. They're not just a sterile abstraction. And so as you think about focusing on and communicating with different people and communities, think about how they see themselves in your data. And if we can take that more empathetic approach to our own presentations and our own data visualizations, we will be able to put some good out in the world and help more people see themselves in the data. So thank you very much, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of today's conference.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was a fascinating talk, lots of energy, lots of lovely colours and diagrams. And I particularly liked CNN's use of something else. That's quite extraordinary. Yeah. Great questions coming in. One question here that's very popular. What resources or guidelines are available to know more about the sensitivities related to diversity and learn how to apply the related rules to data visualization?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll have to say that there isn't a lot of work in this topic. We have written this long report. It's about I don't know, 40 or 50 pages that goes into detail on all the topics that I mentioned, plus many others, some that are broader to the field of research and data visualization. And we have a long list of references and resources in that document that you can use, and I'll post the link into the chat window in just a moment, that you can use, that different groups sort of attacking this question, this problem from different angles. But when it comes to data visualization specifically, we think this is one of the first pieces out there, and we hope that it becomes one of the cornerstone documents that we can all use to think about taking this approach going further.
Thank you. We've got so many more interesting questions. You've raised so many interesting points and subtleties in this topic. The next most popular question is from Wolfgang Egner, who asks, great talk with many interesting aspects to consider. Regarding the point of variation, what representation techniques would you recommend to show variation without getting too technical or complex?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. You could see in the visualization that I showed a little Wilkinson dot plot where I have the major groups are shown and also showing the variation within those groups. So that's one way to do it. I mean, you could use lots of other visualization techniques that get at the distribution, like a box and whisker plot or error bars. But the thing about that is it doesn't help people necessarily see the data, right? See the individual data. So I like that dot plot approach. I also like B-swarm charts, which are similar in some ways, where you use individual dots for individual groups. Of course, the difficulty here is in that particular data set, I had about 140 different groups identified. What happens when when those categories get much bigger? How do we represent those groups? And how do we talk about the fact that and even sort of the next step is thinking about some of those groups that I showed have, maybe 100 people identified in some of those groups, and others had tens of thousands of people. So from a statistical perspective, how do we make those comparisons to make the math and the science and the statistics actually truthful? And I think that's a challenge that we still have to consider. We still have to think about. Because it's really important to be considering the sample size as we're representing people and data. But I think to the specific question about data visualization types, I think as we can consider visualizations that are showing the individual, in terms of groups, individual observations, so that our reader can see that we're aggregating here to get into this final number, but there's more variation going on within each of these aggregate categories.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and wish you the very best of luck with the work that you do. You clearly love it, and I'm quite sure you'll have a number of people watching this afternoon racing after your books, which are on the market. Thank you so much.